I spent a fortune on specialists just to find out that the pharmacy that actually matters does not have a counter, it has roots. I am 82 years old, and I am more alive than the 50-year-olds who call me sir out of pity on the street. They see a man with white hair, and they think the story is over. But I have outlived the doctors who gave me 5 years to live, and I have outlived the colleagues who thought they were immortal because they had the best private insurance money could buy. You look at me, and you see an old man in a farmhouse, but I see souls already half dead from the slow poison of a life they were told was successful. I have the clarity of someone who has seen the bottom and decided to climb back out while everyone else was busy buying their own coffins, one steak dinner at a time. 20 years ago, I was exactly where you might be right now. I was a high-stakes corporate litigator in New York City. I lived for federal courtrooms and business dinners where the stakes were as thick as the lies we told ourselves about our own health. I thought a 7-figure retirement fund was a shield against the rot of time. I was wrong. The breaking point came when I was 62. I was in the middle of a closing argument when a sharp numbness crawled up my left arm. A crushing weight slammed into my chest, and the marble floor of the courthouse rushed up to meet my face. I collapsed right there on the expensive stone. In the ambulance, as the sirens screamed, I looked around for my partners. None of them were there. Only my wife Eleanor sat beside me, and I realized in that moment of terror that I had barely spoken a meaningful word to her in weeks. I had built an empire of paper and neglected the temple of my own soul. In the intensive care unit, a cardiologist with a face like a blank wall told me I was lucky to be alive, but that I had the heart of a 90-year-old man. I was 62, with a bank account overflowing and a body that was already surrendering to the grave. I sat in that hospital bed and looked at the machines keeping me tethered to a world I had neglected. I decided right then that I would not end up as just another archived case. I would not let the system that fed on my stress be the one to bury me. I remember the smell of expensive leather and the cold taste of $500 scotch. I was a king in a kingdom made of paper. I lived in a corner office overlooking a city that never sleeps, and I was the one keeping it awake. I thought I was winning. I had the penthouse and the platinum cards and the respect of men who would cut my throat for a fraction of my billable hours. I convinced myself that every hour I spent away from Eleanor and the kids was an investment in their future. I was buying them a life while I was selling mine to the highest bidder. I looked at my bank account and saw a fortress. I thought if I just hit the next 10 million, I would be safe from the vulnerabilities of common men. I ignored the headaches and the way my breath hitched when I climbed a simple flight of stairs. I told myself it was just the price of greatness. I was on a treadmill that only went faster, and I did not know how to step off. I was a ghost in my own home. I would come back late and see my children sleeping and tell myself I was a good provider, but I was just a stranger who paid the mortgage. My life was a series of scheduled battles. I ate when I was told to eat, and I slept when I could not keep my eyes open anymore. I treated my body like a machine that only needed fuel, not care. I thought the best doctors in Manhattan were my safety net. I paid for the premium concierge service, and I felt invincible because I had their private numbers in my pocket. I did not realize that a doctor can only patch a hole after the ship is already sinking. I was the captain of a vessel that was rotting from the inside, and I was too busy polishing the brass to notice the water in the engine room. You might be sitting there right now, thinking you have time. You think your job or your plans or your savings are the shield. You believe the same lie I did, that the world owes you a long life because you worked hard for it. But the universe does not care about your resume. It does not care about your titles. I was Arthur Sterling, the titan of the courtroom, and in 1 second, I was just a pile of meat on a cold floor. I spent 40 years building a legacy that could not even help me take my next breath. I had all the resources in the world, and yet I was spiritually and physically bankrupt. I was living on autopilot, driven by an ego that told me I was immortal, until the moment the lights started to flicker and the music stopped. The air in the courtroom that afternoon was thick with the scent of old wood and the nervous sweat of the jury. I was 62 years old, and I was at the absolute peak of my power. I was delivering a closing argument that would have been studied for decades. I felt invincible. Then I felt the ice. It started as a tiny prick in my left thumb, and within seconds, it was a frozen river rushing up my arm and into my throat. The words died in my mouth. A crushing weight as heavy as a cathedral stone slammed into my ribs. I saw the marble floor rising up to meet me, and I remember thinking how cold that stone felt against my cheek. When I woke up, I was in the back of an ambulance, and the world was screaming. I looked for my partners, the men I called friends, the people I had spent 18 hours a day with for 30 years. Not one of them was there. Only Eleanor sat in the corner of that cramped space, clutching her coat, her knuckles white and her eyes red from crying. I had spent my life building a fortress of wealth to protect my family, but I had become a stranger to the only woman who ever truly loved me. I had traded my presence for a paycheck, and now I was paying the ultimate price. In the intensive care unit, a doctor with a voice like a tombstone told me the truth. He said, "Arthur, you are 62, but your heart is 90, and it is tired of fighting for a man who does not care about it." He gave me 5 years at best, if I lived like a monk and stayed tethered to a pharmacy. I sat in that bed as the machines beeped out the rhythm of my failing life, and I realized I was not just sick, I was bankrupt in every way that mattered. My empire was made of paper, and it was burning down around me. I stared at the ceiling and made a choice that most people are too afraid to even consider. I decided that if I was going to die, I would not do it in a white room surrounded by strangers who only knew my insurance policy. I was going to find a way to take my life back, or I was going to burn out trying. But I did not know then that the path to my survival would require me to walk through a valley of shadows that would take everything I had left. I walked back into my penthouse like a wounded lion trying to buy back my pride with a checkbook. I surrounded myself with a phalanx of private nurses and nutritionists who charged $300 an hour to tell me exactly what I wanted to hear. I swallowed 20 different colored pills every morning with a glass of imported mineral water, thinking that the more I paid for the cure, the faster the rot would stop. I treated my recovery like a high-stakes corporate merger. I had spreadsheets for my blood pressure and digital monitors for my heart rate, but I was still the same arrogant man who thought he could outsmart the grave with a platinum card. I stayed in bed until noon, waiting for the chemicals to kick in, so I could feel enough of a spark to pretend I was still alive. I followed every sanitized rule the medical establishment laid out for me. I ate the bland cardboard food they told me was heart healthy, and I walked on a treadmill in a climate-controlled room because the real world felt too dangerous for a man of my supposed value. I was a prisoner in a gold cage, and I was paying the guards to keep me there. I thought if I just listened to the men with the titles and the clean fingernails, I would be safe. But the more I leaned on their prescriptions, the weaker my legs became, and the more my mind began to cloud with a gray fog of dependency. I was so wrapped up in my own fear that I didn't see the tragedy unfolding right next to me. While I was obsessing over my own pulse and my daily dosage, I failed to see that the light in Eleanor's eyes was starting to flicker. I was so busy trying to save my own skin that I didn't notice she was fading. I thought my money would protect us both. I thought having the best insurance meant we were untouchable by the common miseries of the world. I was a fool who believed that a high balance in a bank account could stop the clock or keep the shadow of the valley away from our door. I watched her get smaller and paler, and my response was to call more specialists and demand more tests. I threw more money at the problem because that was the only language I knew how to speak. I didn't realize that the system I trusted was never designed to give us back our life. It was only designed to manage our long and expensive decline. I spent 2 years waiting for a miracle in a bottle, while the only person who ever truly knew me was slipping through my fingers. And by the time I realized that my wealth was nothing more than a pile of useless paper, the silence in that penthouse had already become deafening. I spend a lot of time out here on this farm, watching the shadows stretch across the porch. The quiet can be a gift, but it can also be a reminder of how much has been lost. Sometimes I wonder if you, listening to me right now, also feel that same cold wind. I wonder if you feel like the world has looked right past us and forgotten our generation, as if our stories are already finished. It would mean a lot to me if you could tell me in the comments what time of day it is where you are. It is good to know I have company on this journey and that I am not just talking to the wind. The silence that followed Eleanor's funeral was a different kind of cold than the marble of the courtroom. It was a hollow ringing in my ears that no amount of money could drown out. I sat in this very farmhouse, staring at a mountain of prescription bottles that looked like a miniature city of plastic on my kitchen counter. I was 64 years old, and I was waiting to die. I was following every instruction from every specialist in Manhattan, and yet I was getting weaker every day. My joints felt like they were filled with broken glass, and my mind was drifting in a fog of chemical fatigue. I looked at the photos of Eleanor on the mantle, and I realized that I had spent 40 years buying her things, but I had not given her a husband who was actually there. And now she was gone, and I was just a ghost in a big house, with a portfolio full of stocks that could not hold my hand or bring me a glass of water. That was my rock bottom. I realized then that the medical system I had put my faith in was not designed to make me whole. It was designed to keep me as a perpetual customer. They wanted to manage my decline, not spark my life. I looked at those pills, and I saw them for what they were: shackles. I decided right then that if I was going to die, I would do it on my own terms, not as a compliant patient in a sterile ward. I threw every single bottle into the trash. My son Robert called me that night and talked to me like I was a child, asking if I had taken my statins, and his pity was the final spark. I did not want his pity. I wanted my dignity back. I started looking back further than the latest journals and the newest synthetic breakthroughs. I looked at how my grandfather lived to 90 without a single pharmacy visit. I started looking at the earth instead of the lab. I realized that my body was not a broken machine. It was a neglected garden. The revelation was brutal and simple. I had been poisoning myself with a lifestyle of convenience and stress, and then trying to cure the poison with more chemicals. I had to strip it all away. I had to stop being Arthur Sterling, the litigator, and start being Arthur, the man who belonged to the land. I had to learn how to feed my cells instead of just filling my stomach. That was the moment the fog began to lift, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt a spark of anger that turned into a fire of purpose. I was not finished yet, and the world was about to find out exactly what an old man with nothing left to lose is capable of doing. I am sitting here in this kitchen, and it feels more like a sanctuary than any boardroom ever did. I stopped looking for miracles in white coats and started looking at what I put on my plate. I learned the hard way that you cannot bribe your way out of a lifetime of neglect. Most people treat their bodies like a trash can and then expect a doctor to perform a magic trick once the lights start to dim. I chose a different path. Let us talk about the sting first. Most people avoid garlic because they are afraid of the smell. They are afraid of the breath of truth. I use it as my wartime antibiotic. It clears the pipes better than any chemical cocktail I was ever prescribed in Manhattan. You do not need a magic pill to scrub your arteries. You need the courage to handle the burn. I remember sitting in those fancy restaurants in Midtown, swallowing expensive lies. And now I swallow a clove of raw garlic and feel the fire moving through my blood. It wakes up the parts of you that the city tried to put to sleep. It is about detoxification. It is about having the grit to face the sharp parts of life instead of hiding behind a sugar coating. Then there is the egg. The medical establishment spent 40 years telling us to avoid them like they were poison. They wanted us to eat processed grains and cardboard cereal because it was easier to control the narrative. I look at an egg and I see a miracle of potential life. It is the foundation. It is what keeps my back straight and my muscles firm enough to chop my own wood at 82, while the men half my age are struggling to get out of their cars. While my colleagues were eating egg white omelets and developing brittle bones, I was reclaiming the power they told me to fear. It is about self-preservation. You have to build a temple that can withstand the wind, and that starts with the strength you put inside of it. I keep a bottle of olive oil on the counter like a holy relic. It is the lubrication of the soul. You think you are getting old because your knees creak and your back aches, but you are actually just rusting from the inside out. You need the healthy fats to keep your thoughts fluid and your heart shielded. This is especially true when the phone does not ring and your children are too busy building their own empires to remember yours. You have to be your own protector. You have to keep your internal engine oiled, or the coldness of this world will seize you up before the winter even hits. It is about resilience. It is about staying supple in a world that wants to turn you into stone. And the yellow dust, turmeric. It is the inner fire. My joints used to feel like they were grinding against sand every time I moved. But the real inflammation was not just in my knees, it was in my chest. I was holding on to grudges from trials I won 30 years ago, and it was eating me alive. The body swells when the mind refuses to let go of old anger. This root heals the physical pain, but it is the act of releasing the bitterness that actually stops the rot. You cannot heal a body that is still fighting old wars. It is an emotional anti-inflammatory. You have to quench the fire of resentment before it burns your house down. Every morning starts with the acid, lemon water. It is a sharp wake-up call that cuts through the fog of sleep. Life is sour, and if you do not learn to digest the bitter parts early in the morning, the world will swallow you whole by noon. Most people want everything sweetened. They want the sugar-coated version of aging, where they can just fade away quietly. But I want the clarity. I want to feel the sting, because it reminds me I am still here. I am still standing, while the men who chose the easy path are already under the dirt. It is about the awakening. You have to face the sharpness of the day with your eyes wide open. I have buried friends who had 10 times the money I do, but they did not have the discipline to honor their own temple. They thought they could buy another decade with a checkbook, but the universe does not take bribes. I am looking out my window now, and I see the storm clouds rolling over the ridge. I know what is coming for all of us eventually, but I am not going to meet it lying down in a hospital gown, waiting for a stranger to change my IV. I am going to meet it on my feet, with fire in my belly and the scent of the earth on my hands. But even with all this strength, there is one shadow that still follows me into the night, and it is the one thing I never prepared for. I am standing up now, and my knees do not complain, because I stopped listening to the people who told me that pain was a requirement of age. I look out at that ridge, and I see the names of men who had 10 times my net worth, but they are already part of the soil because they thought they could buy their way out of a life of neglect. They died with their hands full of gold and their bodies full of rot. I am telling you this because the clock on your wall is not just measuring hours, it is counting down what you have left of your own breath. Do not wait for your heart to stop in a cold room, surrounded by strangers, to finally start loving the man in the mirror. Do not wait for the crushing weight on your chest to realize that your empire is made of glass. If you want to be standing where I am, when the world thinks you should be gone, you have to start by cleaning your plate today. You have to stop treating your body like a landfill and start treating it like the only home you will ever truly own. Share this with that friend who still thinks a pharmacy is a grocery store. Let us save those who still want to be saved before the silence becomes permanent. Because once the light goes out, no amount of money in the world can turn it back on. And I am starting to hear the first notes of a song I am not ready to finish.